Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 401. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to get through on today's show, the war in Ukraine, and also this vote that Rand Paul held in the Senate on repealing the war power resolution for the terror war. So very important stuff to get through on today's show. Please share the show. It's hosted at the Institute. We repost the show on the blog, antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. Follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_, and the show's available anywhere you can listen to podcasts. Let's get into it. All right, first up today, Senate votes down Senator Rand Paul's resolution to repeal the 2001 authorization for use of military force. The Senate on Wednesday voted down an amendment introduced by Senator Paul to repeal the 2001 AUMF that was passed in the wake of the September 11th attacks and used to invade Afghanistan is still justified in wars today. The bill didn't come close to passing and failed in a vote of 9-86, with only 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 1 independent. The vote came ahead of the Senate voting on repealing the 1991 and 2002 AUMS, which is a symbolic move as the authorizations are rarely used to wage war today. I think the last time either one was used was when Trump killed Soleimani. Although I think they even offered other justifications for that because the 2002 AUMF was so weak. So this is from Paul. Today, I offered the Senate a chance to repeal the 9/11/2001 AUMF to reclaim our constitutional powers and send a message to the world that we are a nation of peace. Today, we should have risen above symbolism and repealed the 9/11 authorization for war and shown our respect for the Constitution, our fealty to the rule of law, and our sincere desire that peace, not perpetual war, should be our legacy. The 2001 AUMF is used today to justify the U.S. occupation of Syria, U.S. military occupation of Iraq, the war against al-Shabaab in Somalia, and other special operations across Africa. Most of the groups the U.S. is fighting using the 2001 AUMF didn't exist when the authorization became law. Repealing the 1991 and 2002 AUMS will not have any impact on U.S. operations in the Middle East and Africa, as House and Congress have argued. President Biden has previously claimed Article 2 of the Constitution as his authority to justify airstrikes against Shia militants in Iraq and Syria. During the debate in the Senate, Senator Tim Kaine says the president has Article 2 powers to defend against Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and is doing it every day. So this is obviously a huge disappointment. Not that I expected this to go through, but that only 9 senators actually support repealing a 20-year-old war authorization that was intended for Afghanistan, and that war is now over, is really disappointing. Now, it does signal that the members of Congress really do understand what these war authorizations do and why they want to keep them in place, as Congress doesn't want to have any responsibility for war. So if the president can do whatever he wants on the war issue, that's actually better for Congress. Now, you know, I was in high school civics class where we learned about balance of powers and how the framers of the Constitution gave the Congress the power to declare war, with the idea that the president will just go to war anywhere, but Congress would be more interested in reining the president in. Well, in our society now, Congress has just given this power to the president, allowing the president to wage endless wars, and there never being any responsibility on Congress for anything. Congress is, you know, a social club. It's a economic club, right? Like everybody there gets really rich. Everybody there, you know, gets all these fancy meetings and they go all these social events and everything like that. And the rest of us fight the wars. And so they really don't care about those whatsoever, especially since most of them make all their fortunes on either investing in or getting donations from the military industrial complex, which certainly wants to see this AUMF remain in effect. All right, next up, let's move on to the war in Ukraine. This article was posted at the Libertarian Institute on March 23rd by myself and Connor Freeman, titled UN has planned to curb world hunger, but EU won't lift sanctions. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is attempting to persuade the European Union to lift sanctions on Belarusian fertilizer industry, but is making little progress, according to Politico. The UN believes removing the export restrictions will help get more agricultural products to Africa. However, the EU claims the sanctions are applying pressure on Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. Gutierrez traveled to Brussels on Thursday in an effort to secure an agreement with the European diplomats to lift sanctions on potash, a type of fertilizer. Politico notes that his proposal to reduce hunger will not be accepted by the EU. There is no way we will agree to degrade our sanctions on Belarusian fertilizer, an unnamed European diplomat told the outlet. The country most responsible for keeping the sanctions imposed is Lithuania. The idea is to reach a similar agreement to the one that we had on the Russian sanctions, but Lithuania is making it a bit difficult for at the moment, a diplomat said. Lithuania has the support of other Baltic states and Poland. This is from the Political article. Lithuania argues that allowing Belarusian fertilizers to flow through the EU would hand a lifeline to Lukashenko's fiefdom, but do little to alleviate food insecurity. Before the sanctions were applied, fertilizer was Belarus's second largest export and was shipped through Lithuanian ports. Brazil and West African countries are some of the nations most dependent on Belarus for fertilizer. One European diplomat said the countries have used ingenious methods to circumvent the sanctions. Prior to being blacklisted, Belarus accounted for 20% of the global supply of potash. Now, I think this is important to note that even though these sanctions are in place and they're doing a lot of damage to the world economy, that places are finding ways to get around the sanctions and to smuggle sanctioned goods. So that's even noted in the article by the European officials. So back to mine and Connor's article, Turkey and the UN brokered an agreement between Kiev and Moscow last year to allow the export of agricultural products from Ukrainians' heavily mined Black Sea ports. 11 million tons of goods have been shipped from the Ukrainian ports under the deal, which was extended for a second time last week before its expiration date. And I have talked about this a little bit on the show and how this the agreement, that Black Sea agreement, that's been so critical at shipping the agricultural goods from Ukrainian ports, Russian and Ukrainian agricultural goods, is in jeopardy as Western sanctions on Russia are causing that agreement not to live up to its full potential, and Moscow has an issue with that. So we touch on that a little bit right here. According to Moscow, the deal is only being extended for 2 months and may not be renewed again, as the U.S.-led sanctions blitz is interfering with the export of Russian agricultural goods, including fertilizer, despite the exemptions. The Russians contended that the separate agreement with the UN was supposed to alleviate pressure and has not succeeded. Russia's ambassador to the UN recently admonished the Security Council that the international organization must recognize that no leverage to exempt Russian agricultural export operations from Western sanctions, and that ambassador added, if Brussels, Washington, and London are genuinely interested in to continue the export of food from Ukraine through the maritime humanitarian corridor, they have 2 months to exempt from sanctions the entire chain of operations which accompanies the Russian agricultural sector. Unless the impasse is resolved, the intransigence of the anti-Russian coalition in Washington and Moscow may cost the global south many lives in the coming months. For example, drought-stricken Somalia, where 43,000 people, mostly young children, starved to death last year, import 90% of its grain and much from Ukraine, and much of the population is currently facing famine. So, these plans to curb sanctions are very important especially for a particular type of goods, and it's really unfortunate that the Western countries are far more concerned about trying to punish the leaders of those countries than to allow the global economy to operate, which will, of course, help the food insecurity problems in some areas of the world. Putin says Russia will deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Russian President Vladimir Putin said Saturday that Moscow will deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus at the request of Minsk. Announcing the decision, Putin compared the move to NATO's nuclear sharing program, under which there are nuclear weapons deployed to 5 territories of allied countries: Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Turkey. There's nothing unusual here. Firstly, the United States has been doing this for decades. They have long deployed their tactical nuclear weapons on the territory of their allied countries. Putin said the Russian leader insisted that the deployment wouldn't violate Moscow's non-proliferation commitments. Putin also said the decision was related to the UK supplying Ukraine with depleted uranium rounds for its British-made Challenger 2 tanks. Depleted uranium ammunition is radioactive and is linked to cancer and birth defects, especially in Iraq, where U.S. forces use an enormous amount of the controversial munitions. And we were talking about in the show expecting a big reaction from Russia to the depleted uranium rounds. So I guess this isn't surprising. I thought it would be something more directly related to the battlefield in Ukraine, but at the same time, this is moving around nuclear material, which I guess they see that's what the UK is doing by deploying the depleted uranium rounds. So in response to the announcement, the US hasn't said it hasn't seen any indication that Russia is planning to use nuclear weapons. White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby also said the US hasn't seen Russia move any nuclear weapons around yet. Putin said the plans for Russia to build a facility in Belarus to store the nuclear weapons, which will be completed on July 1st. Russia has previously provided Belarus with nuclear-capable Iskander missiles that are helping upgrade the country's warplanes so they can carry nuclear warheads. We have already helped our Belarusian colleagues to re-equip their planes. 10 planes are ready to apply this type of weapon. We have handed over to Belarus well-known and very effective Iskander systems that can carry nuclear warheads, Putin said. The U.S. and NATO have said they don't see any reason to adjust their own nuclear posture at this point, but one way NATO could respond to the development is by placing nuclear weapons in countries that are closer to Russia. The U.S. has not deployed nuclear weapons to countries each of Germany that have joined NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the delusion of the Warsaw Pact. But some Eastern European countries are willing to host nukes, including Poland. Finnish officials have also not ruled out the idea of hosting nuclear weapons, and Finland is poised to join NATO soon. Next up, we have Ukrainian President Zelensky asking for another major escalation in the war against Russia. Ukrainian President Zelensky on Thursday demanded that European countries provide more military aid and add more sanctions on Russia, warning that not doing so will prolong the war. Zelensky said in a virtual address to EU leaders that they should provide longer-range weapons and Western-made fighter jets. He thanked Slovakia and Poland for providing Soviet-made MiG-29 warplanes, but said Kiev needs modern aircraft. And this is from Zelensky. Is there a rational motivation for the protraction of providing modern aircraft? He dismissed concerns about Russia potentially escalating the war in response, pointing to the provision of the German-made Leopard tanks. Remember how many Russian threats there were when it came to transferring Leopards and other tanks more advanced than those our soldiers had previously had. These are more advanced tanks are already in use in Ukraine. So what did Russia do in response? We all have to get around the fact that a terrorist state bluffs more often than it can escalate. Zelensky sharpened his rhetoric when discussing sanctions and criticized the European Union for not adding more. The protraction with the European sanctions package is becoming increasingly troublesome. The Ukrainian leader claimed that efforts are not sufficient to prevent Russia from circumventing sanctions and that other countries think they can ignore sanctions. That's why sanctions must be expanded. There cannot be the slightest hint of delaying decisions on sanctions. And I really think what he's talking about here is secondary sanctions, maybe not actually sanctioning more of the Russian economy, but sanctioning countries that are importing goods from Russia. Zelensky demanded that there must be no more slacking of sanctions, especially in the name of food security. Western sanctions on both Russia and Belarus have imperiled grain and fertilizer shipments. The EU wants to relieve tensions to get more agricultural goods to Africa and elsewhere in the world. And obviously Zelensky is saying, no, we can't allow any of this. So I think Ukraine doesn't want the grain deal to stay in place, or at least for Russian goods not to be able to be shipped under the grain deal. Next up, this is Dave DeCamp, March 26th at antiwar.com. Zelensky says no counteroffensive until the West sends more weapons. Zelensky said Saturday that Ukraine's counteroffensive can't begin until the U.S. and Western countries send more weapons and ammunition. When asked about the potential counteroffensive in an interview with the Japanese newspaper outlet, Zelensky said Ukraine can't start yet and can't send our brave soldiers to the front lines without tanks, artillery, and long-range rockets. We are waiting to receive ammunition from our partner countries. If there is a political will, ways can be found to help us. We are at war and cannot wait, he added. He said the military situation in eastern Ukraine is not very good due to a lack of ammo. Ukrainian and Russian forces are still battling for the eastern Donbass city of Bakhmut, where both sides are using an enormous amount of ammunition. Zelensky said Russian troops are using 3 times as much ammunition as the Ukrainian side. Zelensky's comments echo what senior Ukrainian government officials told the Washington Post earlier this month. The official told the Post that Kiev doesn't have the people or the weapons to pull off a counteroffensive. Ukrainian soldiers fighting on the front have told several media outlets that they're being sent into what has become known as a meat grinder in Bakhmut with little support or ammunition. New conscripts are being sent there with barely any training. The U.S. and its allies have pledged a lot of new military aid for Ukraine over the past few months, but Zelensky keeps saying it's not enough. The Biden administration wants Ukraine to launch a counteroffensive to make territorial gains this spring, but the prospect now seems unlikely. And so it's really interesting that we're hearing this from Kiev, which has been so guarded and, tries to be, I think, so optimistic all the time about the war prospects, to say that they can't wage a counteroffensive. It's kind of interesting. Now, we always have to consider the possibility that this is war propaganda from the Ukrainian side, that they're putting this out in an effort to get more troops and more weapons from the West. I don't know if that's really what's going on or if it would even work, but always something to consider. All right, I talked about this last week, so I'm going to do this one quick, but it looks like the Turkish parliament is starting to move forward with the bill to ratify Finland's NATO membership. It passed the Foreign Affairs Committee that would ratify Finland's NATO membership after President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says country would approve bringing Helsinki into the alliance without Sweden. Turkey's full parliament, the Grand National Assembly, still needs to approve the bill, and ratification is expected to happen before Turkey's May 14th presidential election, so month and a half from now. And, this is pretty much in line with what I wrote and what I talked about on the show last week in regard to this. Next up, World Bank says Ukraine reconstruction will cost at least $411 billion. All right, the World Bank issued a new report that said Ukraine's reconstruction will now cost at least $411 billion over the next 10 years, and that number will rise as the war drags on. The report says the $411 billion figure should be seen as a minimum, as needs will continue to rise as the war continues. The World Bank vice president previously estimated reconstruction costs between $525 billion and $630 billion. The report issued Wednesday was more precise and was produced jointly with the U.S. and Ukrainian governments. So that's interesting that it's lower. I didn't expect that. I assumed they would always give a higher and higher estimate because it's, something that people could attach onto. There's been $1 trillion in damage done to Ukraine or something like that. I guess the other possibility is that the higher number you give, the more unachievable it might seem, and so giving a lower number could help people to buy in to the reconstruction effort. And remember, all of this, it has very, very, very much propaganda to it. After the new report came out, the vice president of the World Bank said Ukraine's reconstruction will take several years and will require public investments, complemented by significant private investments to increase available financing for reconstruction. And the American banks are already licking their chops. Bankers from JP Morgan Chase recently visited Ukraine in February and signed a memorandum of understanding with Zelensky and agreed to help raise private capital to fund for Ukraine's reconstruction. In January, Zelensky addressed the United Nations of Senate In January, Zelensky addressed the United States National Association of State Chambers, and said American corporations would find big business in rebuilding Ukraine. Everyone can become a big business by working with Ukraine in all sectors, from weapons and defense construction, from communications to agriculture, from transportation to IT, from banks to medicine, he said. The new estimate from the World Bank comes as there is no sign that the fighting in Ukraine will end anytime soon. China recently launched an initiative to try to foster peace talks between warring sides, but it's not clear if it has any real chance to lead to negotiations at this point. All right, next up, this one from David Camp. The U.S. and EU conduct first ever naval joint exercises on Friday aimed at China. While most EU members are NATO allies of the U.S., this marks the first time that the U.S. formally conducted joint naval drills with vessels operating as a part of the EU force. An American guided missile destroyer participated in the drills with one Spanish ship and one Italian vessel. It's unclear where these drills were held. Now, we do know that the U.S. held some drills in the South China Sea. A U.S. warship sailed near Chinese-controlled islands in the South China Sea. On Thursday, this is last week, the U.S. sailed a warship near the Chinese-controlled Parcel Islands in the South China Sea amid heightened tensions between Washington and Beijing in the region. The China's People's Liberation Army said it drove away the guided missile destroyer, the USS Millis, after it illegally sailed near disputed islands. The Navy 7th Fleet disputed the claim, saying that the warship was not dispelled. I guess they claim it, just did its mission, was on its way. The U.S. does not recognize most Chinese claims to the South China Sea and began challenging them during the Obama administration by sending warships near Chinese-controlled islands, maneuvers dubbed freedom of navigation operations. China and several of its Southeast Asian neighbors have overlapping claims to the South China Sea. The Parcel Islands are claimed by China, Taiwan, and Vietnam. The dispute has become a major source of tensions between the U.S. and China as Washington became involved and has increased its military activity in the South China Sea. The U.S. also backs the Philippines' claims against China and has been deepening its military cooperation with the Philippines. The U.S. and the Philippines signed a deal last month that will give the U.S. military access to 4 more bases in the Philippines, including Philippines Providence facing the South China Sea. China is strongly against the U.S. military expansion in the Philippines and has made it clear to the Philippines government. Beijing is not happy with some of the new bases that will be in the northern areas of the Philippines near Taiwan. All right, the U.S. Pentagon leaders are saying that it's gearing up its budget to prepare for war with China. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley told Congress on Thursday that the Pentagon's 2024 budget will help the country prepare for a future war with China. Milley insisted the massive $842 billion budget request is meant to deter war, but says it will also provide the U.S. military the ability to fight one. He told the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense that deterring and preparing for conflict is extraordinarily expensive, but it is not nearly as expensive as fighting a war, and this budget prevents and prepares us to fight if necessary. The Pentagon identified China as the most comprehensive and serious challenge to the United States security strategy in the 2022 National Defense Strategy, and lately the U.S. military leaders have been speaking more explicitly about how they are preparing for a direct war with China despite the risk of nuclear war. President Biden has even vowed to defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack. Milley says China's actions are moving it down the path to war, confronting a potential conflict with its neighbors and potentially the United States, echoing similar warnings made by Chinese officials. Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang warned earlier this month that the U.S. doesn't change course on its military buildup in the Asia Pacific and other policies aimed at China, it will lead to conflict and confrontation. The Pentagon budget request will further expand the U.S. military footprint in the region by building up a plan known as the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. This budget includes a 40% increase over last year for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative to an all-time high of $9.1 billion. Austin said during the hearing. He continued that will fund a stronger force posture, better defense for Hawaii and Guam, and deeper cooperation with our allies and partners. For China, Hawks in Congress, what the Pentagon has asked to spend in 2024 is not enough, including funding for other agencies. The President Biden's military spending request totals $886.4 billion. Congress is expected to add tens of billions more, as it did with Biden's 2022 and 2023 budget request. And that first chunk of money is becoming clear here. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, that's Indo-PACOM, is seeking, $3.5 billion more than the President Biden has requested for his 2024 military budget. The other 5 U.S. military commands are also asking for more than what Biden has allocated for them, but nowhere near what Indo-PACOM's seats. Combined, the other 5 commands' extra spending requests are less than half of what Indo-PACOM is asking for. So this is the military command that I think probably stretches from Hawaii to India. Would be my guess is the best way to describe that. It includes Australia, China, it looks like Korea, Mongolia here. So this is a fairly large chunk of the world. The biggest chunk of the Indo-PACOM command request is for $511 million for regional campaigns to quickly mass forces multiple times a year as a part of synchronized operations, activities, and investments. So they want to be able to carry out $500 million more of war games next year. The command is also looking for more missiles, including $375 million for extended range Standard missile sits, $493 million for Tomahawks, $151 million for precision strike missiles. The request also includes $147 million to upgrade missile defense systems in Guam. And so I'm sure Congress will give them at least that, maybe even more. That tends to be how it goes. All right, a few stories on the Middle East before we wrap up here. I wrote this story for antiwar.com on Saturday. More U.S. airstrikes in Syria kill at least 19, multiple American bases attacked. 3 American bases in eastern Syria were targeted with rockets and drones on Friday. 1 American soldier was injured in the attack. The American bases came under fire after the U.S. carried out airstrikes in eastern Syria. The violence in Syria escalated on Thursday when a U.S. outpost was attacked. 1 contractor was killed in a drone strike. Additionally, 5 soldiers and 1 contractor were wounded. The Pentagon claimed it had intelligence that the drones that were used in the attack were of Iranian origin. This is something to be skeptical of, and also to remember that just if the drone did come from Iran, it doesn't necessarily mean that Iran gave whatever group used that drone to attack the United States. It could have been for a number of reasons. There was also some reporting, if you follow Idris Ali on Twitter, he is the Reuters Pentagon correspondent, and he said that he had sources that said that the U.S. air defense system at that base were not 100% functioning properly, and that seems to be how this attack got through. So back to my article. Biden responded by authorizing airstrikes against groups affiliated with Iran in the region. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said the American forces conducted airstrikes in eastern Syria against facilities used by groups affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. It is estimated that 19 soldiers were killed by the American bombs. Iran said there would be a counter response to the airstrikes. This from the spokesperson for the Supreme National Security Council of Iran. Any pretext to attack bases created at the request of the Syrian government to deal with terrorism and the Islamistic elements in this country will be met with an immediate counter response. So whether these 3 attacks were somehow back channel wise authorized by Iran, and that was their counter response, or if Iran is planning something else is yet to be seen. The Pentagon also warned it would respond to further attacks. We are postured for scalable options in the face of additional Iranian attacks, CENTCOM Commander General Michael Eric Kurilla said. On Friday, the National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said Biden immediately authorized the airstrikes after learning about Thursday's attack. He made the decision very, very shortly in that discussion to authorize strikes against these particular targets, he added, "We are not seeking conflict with Iran," which is interesting. They're saying that we're going to bomb Iranian-backed sources, but we're not looking to get into a conflict with Iran. So that was Thursday. Now Friday, 3 additional attacks against American outposts occurred. The first incident occurred at around 8 a.m. local time and resulted in some civilian casualties. On March 24th at approximately 8:05 a.m. local time, 10 rockets targeted coalition forces at Green Village in northeast Syria, according to a statement from Central Command. The attack resulted in no injuries to U.S. or coalition personnel and no damage to equipment or facilities. One rocket missed the facility by almost 5 kilometers, striking a civilian house, causing significant damage and causing minor injuries to 2 women and 2 children. That's from the CENTCOM statement. That's what they claimed happened. I haven't seen any, individual confirmation of that. Later in the day, the U.S. military bases at the Al Omar and Conoco oil fields were hit with rockets and drones. Fewer details have ever been reported about these attacks, but Fox News national security correspondent Jennifer Griffin tweeted that U.S. officials said one involved an Iranian proxy force firing rockets, a second involved multiple Iranian drones. And in that second set of attacks, that's apparently when we had an American soldier wounded, although what actually happened there is still there's not as many details out as there are about the first 2 attacks. So Tehran entered the Syrian war at the request of Damascus. Iranian support for forces has helped to push back jihadist groups. However, the Syrian government and its partner forces, including ones backed by Iran, have come into conflict with American forces as well. As a part of its economic war against Damascus, Washington occupies the eastern third of Syria, including most of the country's oil and wheat resources. Damascus views the American forces as illegally occupying Syrian territory. The U.S. has an estimated 900 troops in eastern Syria. These forces have come under attack about 80 times since 2021. So we have this situation where American forces are in Syria. They're there illegally occupying. They're there stealing the oil and the wheat from the Syrian people. They're ensuring that the war in Syria goes on, and they're coming under attack frequently. And this still isn't enough for the Biden administration to decide just to bring those troops home. White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said Sunday that President Biden is committed to staying in Syria following a series of attacks on U.S. bases and airstrikes in the country. Here's what's not going to change. The mission and ISIS is not going to change. We have under 1,000 troops in Syria. We are going after that network, which is greatly diminished, still viable and critical. So we're going to stay at that task. And this is just disgusting, right? Like, the Syrian government is more than happy to kill ISIS. The Iranian Ba'ath militias are more than willing to kill ISIS. The Shia groups in the country that, maybe don't take direct, orders from Tehran or anything like that, more than willing to attack ISIS. Everybody in Syria and Iraq hates ISIS and are capable of taking them out. It's actually the U.S., occupying this region that is weakening the Syrian state and preventing the Syrian government from, finishing off the remains of ISIS. Recently, ISIS kidnapped a bunch of Syrian citizens and slit their throats. So, the government in Damascus has a lot of, reason to finish these guys off. We don't need our troops there coming under attack all the time. It's just completely ridiculous. Now, one last story before we wrap up here. And this one, for any listeners of this show, this is something we have covered extensively. AFRICOM engages in military and troop training in Africa, and then those troops go on to carry out coups. The interesting part is that this was put forward by a congressman. So General Michael Langley, the head of U.S. AFRICOM forces, said he was grilled by Representative Matt Gaetz on Thursday about African soldiers who receive U.S. military training and go on to carry out coups. Langley insisted it was a very small number of Africans who receive U.S. training and later go on to be involved in coups against civilian governments, and said the programs focus on core values. I think there's an article by Nit Turse where the number is between 12 and 20. So even if you're training thousands of soldiers, and 12 and 20 is a small number compared to thousands, that's still a lot of coups in Africa that have happened in the past, 10 years or so. Very concerning. I think that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today, everyone. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Please share this show if you can, and I will be back with more shows later in the week.